A blessed day, everyone. I am Jamela, and welcome again to Book and I. This is a program that will look on different books and their insights, which will help us to grow more in faith and practice. We have 3 more topics to cover before this book ends, as we learn from the previous part of this book that talks about what the gospel is, the gospel renewal, contextualization of the gospel, the problem and the responses of the church in cultural change. Now, we are in the last part of this book that talks about movement. How can we really be missional? That is the first question that pops in this chapter that needs to be addressed by the church. And to know more about it, let us dig deeper in the search for the missional church. This chapter explores what it truly means for a church to be missional. Mr. Keller begins by explaining that the word missional has become widely used among Christians, but it is often understood in different ways, creating confusion about what a missional church actually is. The central idea is that mission is not simply one activity or department of the church. Rather, the church itself is called to participate in the mission of God. Mr. Keller explains that the church is living in a post-Christian culture, especially in the Western context. Christianity can no longer assume that society understands Christian beliefs or that people will naturally come to church because of tradition or social expectations. Because of this change, the church must rethink how it carries out its mission. Christians are not simply called to invite people into the church, but are also called to be sent into the world as witnesses of the gospel. New Begin Bosch Rescue. The New Begin Bosch Rescue highlights how Leslie New Begin and David Bosch helped the church rediscover its mission in a changing post-Christian culture. New Begin emphasized that the church should see Western society as a mission field and that every aspect of church life should participate in mission. Through the concept of Mission Day, mission is understood as participation in God's work in the world while remaining centered on Christ and His work on the cross. Bosch further developed this understanding by emphasizing the restoration of creation. He called the church to avoid 2 extremes, withdrawing completely from society or trying to create a Christian society. Instead, the church should engage culture, challenge its idols, serve others, and live as a contrast community. They also warned about the cultural captivity of the church, where Christians can unknowingly adopt the values and idols of society instead of challenging them. Ultimately, their approach calls the church to proclaim Christ, pursue justice, engage culture, and live distinctly as God's people while keeping the gospel at the center. The missional church movement today. Building on these ideas of New Begin and Bosch, the missional church movement began to grow. The movement continued to emphasize Mission Day, the understanding that the church participates in God's mission to redeem and restore creation. As Western culture became increasingly post-Christian, the church had to rethink how it engages and communicates with the society around it. However, as the idea of the missional church became more popular, different interpretations also emerged. Craig Van Gelder and Dwight Sale identified 4 broad and overlapping streams that describe how people have understood what it means to be missional. First, being missional is being evangelistic. This approach focuses on evangelism and missions, particularly on bringing people to individual salvation through the church. It emphasizes that every Christian is called to participate in reaching others with the gospel. Second, being missional is being incarnational. Rather than simply inviting people into church programs, this approach emphasizes Christians living among and serving their communities. The idea is to be present in the community, build meaningful relationships, and demonstrate Christ through everyday life. Third, being missional is being contextual. This approach focuses on understanding the culture in which the church is ministering. Christians are encouraged to communicate the gospel in ways that people can understand while still allowing the gospel to challenge cultural values and assumptions. And fourth, being missional is being reciprocal and communal. This approach emphasizes building communities that participate with God in addressing injustice, broken social structures, and the renewal of society. It sees mission not only as reaching individuals, but also as participating in God's work of bringing healing and restoration to the world. What do these approaches have in common? Although these four approaches differ in how they understand and practice mission, they still share several important ideas. First, they recognize that we are living in a post-Christian culture, where the church can no longer assume that people already understand or follow Christian beliefs. Because of this, the church must intentionally engage the culture rather than simply expect people to come to church. Second, they recognize the cultural captivity of the church. The church must examine how cultural values such as individualism and self-centeredness may have influenced Christians. At the same time, the church must learn how to communicate the gospel in ways that people can understand while still challenging values that go against God's truth. Third, these approaches agree that mission belongs to the whole church. Every Christian is sent by God, not only pastors or missionaries. Believers are therefore called to live out their faith in their workplaces, communities, relationships, and everyday lives. Finally, they emphasize that the church should be a contrast community. Christians are called to demonstrate the gospel not only through preaching and calling people to faith, but also through love, justice, service, unity, and the way they live together. So, despite the differences among these approaches, they all point us toward one important truth. The church is called to understand its culture, engage it wisely, equip every believer for mission, and demonstrate the gospel through both word and deed. The key takeaway from this chapter is that the church must recognize that the world around it has changed. And therefore, the way the church carries out its mission must respond wisely to that change without changing the gospel itself. A missional church does not simply wait for people to come inside the church. It goes out into the world because God is a sending God. Christians are called to bring the gospel into their relationships, workplaces, communities, and everyday lives. The church must also avoid two extremes: withdrawal from culture and uncritical conformity to culture. Instead, it should remain faithful to scriptures while understanding its cultural context, serve the community while proclaiming Christ, and demonstrate the gospel through both its words and its way of life. Ultimately, Mr. Keller's vision of the missional church is a church that is sent by God, centered on the gospel, deeply rooted in Christian community, engaged with culture, and committed to being a blessing to the world around it. The church does not merely have a mission. It exists to participate in the mission of God. And that is our chapter for today. Hope you learned something, and may the peace of Christ be with us all. Again, this is Book and I.